All right, welcome everyone. I just wanted to say thank you for joining us all this afternoon. Really excited to be doing our virtual lecture series for Black History Month again this year. It's a program we just started last year for the first time, so we're very excited to be doing it again. Lots of great speakers this year, and we set the bar kind of scarily high for ourselves with our first speaker. So Dr. Afua Cooper, very excited to have her here today. I guess the simplest way to put it is that she's extremely accomplished. Um, Multi-award winning speaker, scholar, historian, author, poet, performer, social and cultural commentator, currently principal investigator at the Black People's History of Canada, which is an exciting new project. Killam Research Chair, Black History and African Diaspora Studies at Dalhousie, visiting scholar at the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, member of the International Scientific Committee of Roots of Enslaved Peoples for UNESCO, and many, many awards. Some of the more recent ones, the 2015 Nova Scotia Human Rights Award, 2020 Portia White Prize, the 2021 Dalhousie President's Award for the Advancement of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusiveness, and the Royal Society of Canada's 2022 J.B. Tyrrell Historical Medal for Outstanding Contribution to Canadian History, among many, many other accomplishments. So we're very honored, very excited to have Dr. Afua Cooper here today. So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Cooper, and we can get started.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for inviting me, and extend a further thanks to the Simcoe County Museum staff. I'm also happy that we have this audience, and I thank you for coming out. I'm talking about Henry Bibb. His full name is Henry Walton Bibb, as the person who founded what became the first Black newspaper in Canada, The Voice of the Fugitive. And, you know, Henry Bibb did so many things in his short life. He died when he was 39 years old, believe it or not, but he accomplished a lot. He lived in the United States and he lived in Canada. And I'll talk more about his cross-border presence as the lecture unfolds. He was the newspaper publisher, but he was also an abolitionist. An abolitionist at that time means someone who advocates for the immediate end of slavery, slavery in this case, American slavery in the US South. Henry Bibb was a community builder. He founded villages in what became, you know, in that area in Essex County, which is one of the counties that borders the Detroit River and further inland into at southwestern Ontario. He was an immigrationist, and what that means is someone who advocates for the immigration of people from one place to another. So leaving from one place and going or coming to another place. And Henry Bibb advocated for Canada West, present-day Ontario. Before Canada West, the place was called Upper Canada. Advocated that free African Americans should leave the United States and emigrate to Canada or Ontario, and that runaway slaves like himself should also do that. When you run away from slavery, do not stop in the northern states, come straight to Canada. So he was born in Shelby County, Kentucky, in I would say in 1814. When you look at the literature about him, it says 1815, but I know it's not 1815. because I've done some work. His mother was pregnant with him in 1813. So either she gave birth in 1813 or 1814. Nonetheless, I mean, for people to say he was born 1815, that's they're not far off, especially when you think that for many, many enslaved people, there's not a birth date. Um, his mom was biracial. His mom's father was white. Her mom was black. The mother was enslaved too. And Henry Bibb's father was a white man. He has the name Bibb, which is a big name in Kentucky. When you go to Kentucky and Virginia and Ohio even, you'll find a lot of people called Bibbs. They are white Bibbs. They're Bibbs who are white. They're Bibbs who are black. They're Bibbs who are in between, like our Henry. It's said that his father was a state senator, a man by the name of James Bibb. So Bibb, if you're looking at blood quantum, he was only quarter black. Nonetheless, he inherited the status of his mother. His mother was enslaved, and children inherited the condition of their mother. If she was enslaved, children are enslaved. If she's free, children are free. The paternity of children in enslavement was irrelevant. It went through the mother. The status went through the mother. So he slaved on a plantation. At the age of 18, he married a fellow slave. And when I say married, you know what I mean. Because the marriage of enslaved people was not recognized by law. So he and Melinda, the woman to whom he made that union with, they jumped the broom. Later on, they had a daughter called Mary Frances, and it was the abuse of the daughter by the hands of the slaveholder, Mrs. Gatewood, and also Mr. Gatewood, the Gatewoods, that prompted Henry Bibb to attempt his first flight from slavery, which he did in the winter of 1837. He fled Kentucky, crossed the Ohio River, made it as far north as Detroit, and perhaps he did cross over the Detroit River into Ontario or Canada West. We don't know. He doesn't really state that in his narrative, which we're following to look at his trajectory, the trajectory of his life in slavery. We know he stayed in Detroit. He was there for 6 months. He worked, he earned money, and he decided that he was going to go back to Kentucky to free his wife and child from slavery and then escape with them to the north. However, he was betrayed and he was caught, and he, the wife, and the child, the baby, Mary Frances, were sold farther south. They eventually ended up in Louisiana in the Red River District. So here's a man, he endured slavery in Kentucky, upper south. Now he's going in the deep south, the lower south, Louisiana. He and his wife and child tried escaping again from Louisiana. There's a whole series of escapes that they engaged in. But they were caught, and Henry Bibb was sold away from his family. He was sold into Texas, and his wife and child were sold to a slaveholder in Mississippi. He never saw them again. And that's one of the vagaries of slavery, or one of the traumas, really, when families are broken up, people not seeing each other, wives not seeing husband, children not seeing parents, and vice versa. That was it. He did manage to escape from the enslaver in Texas, made his way back to Michigan, like literally crossed the United States to Michigan, and in January of 1842, and there embarked on what became a very successful and international lecture circuit, or lecture career in the abolitionist circuit. So he became a sought-after anti-slavery speaker. You may be wondering how he honed his skills to become such an effective speaker. Once he got to Detroit, he enrolled in school at the Second Baptist Church. His teacher was Reverend Monroe, who was the pastor at that church. And so I imagine he told his story, he told his narrative to the church congregation. Soon enough, he was sought after by the Michigan State Liberty Party, the Michigan Anti-Slavery Society, anti-slavery societies in all of the Midwestern states, and also in New York and New England. One of the attractions why people came out to see Henry Bibb was that he was a real deal. He was a runaway slave. Previously, before people like Henry Bibb and Frederick Douglass joined the lecture circuit, the people who lectured on anti-slavery and abolitionism were whites or free blacks. So when you have people like Bibb now coming on board and saying, I experienced that. This is not something theoretical. This is what slavery is. Look at me. I have lost my entire family. I've lost my child. So people were taken, people were moved by these stories, and he became an effective speaker, and not only effective, but a sought after speaker. And so in 1847, so 5 years after he made his full escape to Michigan, he met Mary Bibb, or her name was Mary Miles, at an anti-slavery convention in New York. Mary Miles was a school teacher. At that time, she was teaching in Ohio. She was a free-born Black woman. She had never endured slavery. She came from the Boston area, born in Rhode Island, but went to school in Boston and trained as a teacher. So he met her in 1847. They began corresponding. They got married in 1848. She went back to teach in Ohio. They seem to have had a sort of long distance relationship. Anyway, we know they eventually were united, because at one point she was living with him in Boston, where he was campaigning in the abolitionist movement. A year later, he published his autobiography, Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American Slave. And this book details his life in slavery and his efforts to escape from bondage. Bibb was now established by 1849 as an abolitionist writer and ranked in terms of influence with Frederick Douglass and William Wells Brown. So if we could just turn the slide a bit, because he was traveling all over the place. He was traveling throughout the Midwest. He was traveling in New England. But then in 1850, what happened was the Fugitive Slave Law. What the Fugitive Slave Law is, from the American Congress, this act that was passed in the American Congress, it empowered slaveholders to pursue and capture their alleged runaway slaves. And so every citizen in the slaveholding states and beyond were sort of corralled by the federal government to assist federal marshals in capturing people whom they believe, were runaway slaves. So what happened? Let's say if you had escaped from Kentucky or Maryland and you were living in Pennsylvania or Michigan or Indiana and so on, living in freedom, these were free states, by the way, but you were no longer free. The Fugitive Slave Law said any federal marshal and, slave owners could come into these free states and capture people who they believe had escaped from bondage. So entire communities of people picked up and left the United States. Entire communities of people in New York, in the Midwestern states, in the New England states, some of whom you know about these stories, they picked up and they left. The Bibbs had an address in Detroit, and basically what they do was to cross the river, Henry and Mary Bibb, and also his mother, whom he had rescued from Southern slavery and was living with him in Detroit. She crossed the river with them into the town of Sandwich. We know Sandwich is now part of Windsor. So thousands and thousands of people fled the northern states, came over to what we call Canada. And you may be wondering, well, you know, Henry Bibb, he was known, everybody, you know, why would he pick up and leave the United States? You know, he was having a great career there. Well, he was still legally a slave, and he could be recaptured by his previous owner or by the government itself. The government could capture you, and if there was not an owner there saying that person is my slave, the government could sell you into slavery. So he left, migrated to Canada, and I believe this is where he made his greatest contribution when he decided to cross the Detroit River. They established their home in Sandwich, very close to the First Baptist Church. We can keep the slide. Next slide, please. Very close to the First Baptist Church, which was built by fugitive slaves. The First Baptist Church, if you know the Windsor, Sandwich area, you will know that church. It's a very famous church. And he and his wife, once they crossed over and established themselves, they had a home on Peter Street. They engaged in what we today call community building. Hundreds and hundreds, literally, of freedom seekers were crossing the Detroit River every single day. In a letter that Henry Bibb wrote to the white abolitionist Louis Tappan from New York, Bibb states that for the last 6 or 8 weeks, our house has been filled with strangers almost every day and night, but we have never turned one from our door without food or lodging if they could put up with such as we had. So there was an emergency at the border. People needed food, people needed clothing. Pretty much today, when we think of refugee situation in Canada, it's the same thing that was happening then in the 1850s because of the fugitive slave law. So many people were coming over that in November of the same year, 1850, Henry Bibb called the Sandwich Convention. He called a conference to discuss the plight of the Black community and the issue of freedom. It was at this conference that Henry Bibb proposed the formation of the Refugee Home Society. The Refugee Home Society was an association designed to help landless Blacks gain independence by becoming farmers and landowners. And by the time of his death in 1854, over 100 families had settled on the Refugee Home Society lands. The motto for the Refugee Home Society was self-reliance and Black elevation. So they were very intentional. He and Mary Bibb, they knew what they wanted and how they went about doing it. They were also part of this abolitionist, what I call cross-border abolitionist circle of people in Essex County, Kent County on the Ontario side, and people in Michigan. A lot of their support came from the Michigan area. You know, the Underground Railroad, this was one arm of the Midwestern Underground Railroad coming through Ohio, Michigan, Detroit, crossing the river into Windsor, Sandwich. So the Sandwich Convention was held in November 1850, and in January 1851, Henry Bibb published January 1st, The Voice of the Fugitive, the first sustained Black newspaper in the country was published. And this paper laid the foundation for the Black press. The platform of The Voice of the Fugitive was abolitionist in orientation. So if I could just briefly sketch out the journalistic platform of The Voice of the Fugitive. Bibb advocated the immediate end of slavery, American slavery that is, and he called for full equality for Black people in Canada. So people are fleeing slavery in America, coming over to Canada, experiencing a lot of what we today call anti-Black racism, and leading this anti-Black charge were newspaper editors, white intellectuals, and other white leaders. And this is one of the reasons that Henry Bibb founded a paper, because the newspapers at the time, perhaps with the exception of the Globe, which evolved into the Globe and Mail, was what Samuel Ringgold Ward called negrophobic. The newspaper saw these Black people coming across the border. They're going to take over Upper Canada. The Black men, you have to be suspicious of them because what they'll do to white. But it was just awful. And that was one of the reasons Henry Bibb founded this newspaper, because he said, we need a paper that can speak for us. We need to plead our cause, because there was no let up from the editorials in the white newspaper. So he called for the end of slavery, full equality for Blacks in Canada, and the acquisition of land/agriculture, because Bibb said agriculture is a true road to freedom. You can't be free unless you own land and you're a farmer. Immigration, I mentioned that already, and education. Education was critical. I said earlier on that Mary Bibb was a school teacher. She indeed, so after she left the United States, came over to Sandwich, she opened a school in her home, because 1850 is this critical year. You have the September, the American Congress passing the Fugitive Slave Act, which just wreaked havoc in the Black communities on both sides of the border. But in Ontario, it's Canada West, but I'll call it Ontario. In July of the same year, the government passed the Separate School Act. So if we could just go down some more. The government passed the Separate School Act. Since we're here, let's look at the 1851 Canada East, Canada West, and Maritime Census. For Canada West, if you look at number 11 there, you see Henry Bibb, editor and publisher. Number 12, Mary Bibb, wife. The lady was a school teacher, okay? She's not wife. And she also co-founded the newspaper. But nonetheless, we will press on. So here the census recording their presence in Canada West, and they are in the Sandwich area. So let's, the next slide, which is on education. This was so critical because the province had passed a Separate School Act, which basically, there was a first Separate School Act in 1844, which says that Black parents could form their own schools so that the Black children could go to those schools. That was an official Separate School Act. But there was a lot of resistance from white school supporters to Black children coming into what we would call the public schools. Then they called it the common schools. So say there's a Separate School Act, a separate school 10 miles from where you're living, but there's a regular common school 5 miles from where you're living. Most parents would want to send their child to the school just away from a mile from their home. But white parents protested that. And it was such an issue that by 1850, Edgerton Rice, who was the superintendent of education at the time, Black parents were suing the municipalities. There was Edgerton Rice and said, okay, we're going to have this Separate School Act, another one where 5 or more Black parents, families, not parents, 5 or more Black families could ask for, and they would be granted a school for their children. But it wasn't something that was mandatory. It wasn't compulsory. They did not have to if there was a common school close by. But white school supporters interpreted to mean that they must. And so that's why you have people like Mary Bibb starting a school, because Black children were disenfranchised as a result of the strict interpretation of the Separate School Act. So here 2 weeks after the Voice was founded, Henry Bibb, he says, "We regard the education of colored people in North America as being one of the most important measures connected with the destiny of our race. By it we can be strengthened and elevated. Without it we shall be ignorant, weak, and degraded. By it we shall be clothed with a power which will enable us to arise from the degradation and command respect from the whole civilized world. Without it we shall ever be imposed upon, oppressed, and enslaved." So you see the importance of education for the Bibbs. Education was the path to freedom. Ironically, Black children, the education of Black children in Canada West was compromised. The Voice of the Fugitive, the newspaper, it published stories in the paper, stories about the activities of the freedom seekers once they're once they arrived in Canada West and what they were doing. Henry Bibb would go down to the ferry stop. The ferry would cross the Detroit River from Detroit and stop at what is now at the end of Willett Street in Windsor. That was the ferry stop. And as freedom seekers came off the ferry, he would interview them. "Who are you? What's your name? Where are you coming from?" And then he would publish little tidbits, small biographies of these freedom seekers in the newspaper. Because of this activity of going down to the ferry stop and interviewing people, Henry Bibb discovered 3 of his brothers who had fled from Missouri slavery. They were kids when they left Kentucky, when they were taken by slaveholders from Kentucky as new lands opened up in Missouri. And they hadn't seen each other from those boys. The youngest would have been 7 years old. And as he was interviewing them, they were telling him about their families in Kentucky and how they went, and they were his brothers. So you can imagine how wonderful that reunion was, especially when he took his 3 brothers to meet their mother, who had not seen them when they were young children. Remember, his mother was now living with him. The Voice of the Fugitive enjoyed a wide circulation in Canada West, the United States, and the British Isles. Yes, he had an agent in the British Isles. A few years later, the name of the paper was changed to the Voice of the Fugitive and Canadian Independent. The latter addition to the paper's title reflects Bibb's commitment to his adopted country and his desire to remain independent. And I should note that while Henry Bibb founded Canada's first Black newspaper, Mary Bibb became Canada's first Black female journalist. We know the name Mary Ann Shadd is there. She founded her paper in 1854, the Provincial Freeman. But Mary Bibb, as a journalist, wrote articles for the Voice of the Fugitive from 1851 to its demise in 1854. She raised money to keep the paper afloat. She garnered new subscribers. As significant, she continued her stellar career as a school teacher in Canada, resisting the Separate School Act that saw in many instances, as I said, Black children being denied an education. So the Voice of the Fugitive, it reported on the community. And then it had these, what I called strong editorials. It really blasted slavery. It called out people's names. It called out the American government as, you know, you're a slaveholding government, shame on you. It published stories to potential readers in the United States, potential fugitives, on the best way to get to Canada. These are the routes, Henry Bibb. These are the best routes. This is the route I took. You may be able to take that route. You should come through Philadelphia, what have you. He published routes, the best routes in the newspaper as to what people should take when they attempt to escape. In 1851, he called another conference, but this time in Toronto. It was called the North American Convention of Colored Freemen. And again, the main theme of the conference was Black security. There were slave catchers all over the place, catching people, impressing them into slavery. Black people's lives were insecure. Not just people who were enslaved, but free Blacks. Free Blacks too had to live with, you know, having eyes at the back of their heads because they could be captured and sold into slavery. We have all seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, which is a story about a free Black man being sold into slavery. By 1851, the Refugee Home Society had become a reality, and people had started to live there and to establish small farms. Henry Bibb also in 1851 co-founded with Black and white abolitionists the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. His work and advocacy for Black rights made him Canada West, I would say, premier Black abolitionist and citizen. We'll just continue looking at the slides, please. Thank you. So upon the application in writing of 5 or more heads of families residing in a township, etc., they could establish a colored school. As I've said, it wasn't mandatory, but it was interpreted by white school supporters to be mandatory. And so Black children were chased away from local common schools. We look at the next slide. Here is Mary, the Bibbs, both Mary and Henry. Mary was teaching day school, as we call it. They also taught Sunday school. Sunday school wasn't just a place where you'd go and read the scriptures. They also taught reading and writing. I mean, there was an emphasis on the scriptures, yes. And so here's Mary Bibb writing to one of their supporters in Michigan saying, we started a Sunday school. These are the number of scholars that we have. We're entirely destitute of Bible and so on and so forth. Mr. Kohoff, we know Mr. Ko is from Michigan, has sent 100 volumes for the Sunday school library. Community building. They have a Sunday school, there's a library. Henry Bibb was also part, he signed the deed for the land for the First Baptist Church, which I've said earlier was established by fugitive slaves. So community building, they were very deliberate, they were very intentional, and they worked hard. Let's look at the next slide. That's what the First Baptist looks like. It's and there you see there's a plaque. That's a provincial plaque talking about the history of the church and how it was established. We'll go on. So this appears in the Voice of the Fugitive. It's a note or a notice of Emancipation Day celebration. The Friends of Freedom will celebrate the abolition of chattel slavery in the British West Indies. And they have all these speakers. Samuel Ringgold Ward, who was still in the States, of Boston, Mr. Johnson of Ohio, J.T. Fisher, Toronto, George Carey, Don Mills, just up the road from them. Dinner will be furnished by the ladies for 25 cents. The proceeds will be appropriated toward erecting a Baptist church. So you can see the importance and the significance of the paper in the community. We'll go on. This is a federal plaque. It's at the old courthouse in what is in Sandwich, Windsor. I mean, it's Windsor, but you know, the old town of Sandwich, a federal plaque for Mary and Henry Bibb, both of them designated as persons of historical significance. The plaque was stolen recently. We don't know if it was a racist act or if it was because of poverty, because there's a lot of copper in the plaque, and people during COVID started stealing a lot of copper from plaques like this, and also from churches and from businesses. Happily, the plaque has been replaced. Henry Bibb was we'll look at the next slide, please. Henry Bibb was no doubt overworked when he became ill from a fever. On Emancipation Day, imagine dying on Emancipation Day. You couldn't choose a better day to die for a man who did the work that he did. August 1st, 1854, he breathed his last breath. Emancipation Day was the day when the Black communities on both sides of the Detroit River celebrated through songs, speeches, fundraisers, river cruises, the end of slavery in the British West Indies. They also celebrated Black freedom, resilience, and success. What a day on which to die. Black denizens on both sides of the river chartered a boat, sailed up and down the ancient waterway, and celebrated and toasted the life of Henry Walton Bibb. But it must be remembered that his wife and companion in struggle, Mary Bibb, was left a grieving widow. Today, Henry Bibb's legacy has been recognized by the Canadian federal government in the form of the federal plaque that we just saw. The plaque stands at the old courthouse in Sandwich, close to the area where the Bibbs once lived, on a street called Peter Street, close to Peter Street. Bibb and his legacy have been also commemorated by the heritage and government groups in New York State, Kentucky, and Michigan. The Henry Bibb Heritage Trail has been established from Louisville, Kentucky to Cincinnati, Ohio, and they want to extend the trail into Ontario. Bibb has also been immortalized in films and text, and Mary Bibb has also been recognized in her own right. There's a park in Windsor at about 3, just before we got into COVID, was renamed in her honor. We look at the next plaque, please. The next slide, rather. This is a provincial plaque, provincial Ontario, and it honors the Puce River community. And it states there that the Puce River community, it owes its existence largely to the Refugee Home Society, the Abolitionist organization led by Henry and Mary Bibb. If you go there in the lakeshore area of east of Windsor along the Lakeshore Road, the Puce River community is back there. You have people like Brian Walls, who is descended from fugitive slaves. He and his family still live in that community on the land that his ancestors owned through the Refugee Home Society. So here's a provincial plaque in their honor. And I'll see if there are other slides. I can't remember. Let's see, John. Yeah, that's it. So thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions. I want to say that the Voice of the Fugitive it started January 1851, and it continued until August 1854, when its offices were torched by arsonists. It never sort of got up. Mary Bibb never revived it, maybe couldn't revive it. She continued her career as a teacher, and she eventually went into business. She opened a dress shop for women. Henry Bibb had died, and and that was when, literally on the ashes of the Voice of the Fugitive, Marianne Shadd started her newspaper, the Provincial Freeman. So this paper, I mean, if you want to look at the history of Canada West at that time through print culture, this paper is a go-to source because it's all there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dr. Cooper. That was excellent, very fascinating story. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. So we have some time. We can open up the floor to questions for any of our guests here. So if you're not familiar with Teams, there is a kind of an option at the top of your screen. There should be a little hand, so you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can send a message in the chat. There's also a little speech bubble at the top of the screen, or you can type a message if you'd rather do that. So if anyone has any questions, anyone have any questions for Dr. Cooper about her talk? I was just going to say it was interesting to learn about that. 'Cause I've done some research in the past about there was a Black community here in the Oro Township.
Yeah.
So I had just kind of always trying to look for other sources, because there's a lot of kind of unanswered questions about that. So it's interesting to learn about that paper as well. So I wonder, like, was that like how local was that paper, or was that really like were they pulling in stories from like how wide of an area would you say?
Yeah. Yes. The paper pulled in stories from there were stories from Toronto. There were, stories from the Niagara region, and also certainly from Essex and Kent counties and Lambton County, where you have the Uncle Tom's Cabin Museum. The name has no change. It's the Josiah Henson African Canadian History Museum. So from those sort of border counties, and also across the river, Michigan, Ohio, news from England, news from the West Indies, because newspapers at the time, they would also, one of the things, you don't have a correspondent in London, England, or in Kingston, Jamaica. So what you do, you would lift stories from papers from those areas and republish it in your paper. So lots of stories from New England, the Midwest. Bibb was also touring. He was constantly on tour in those places. So when you think of it, it was like this, what I call this, this cross-border consciousness, um, because people had families and engage in activities on both sides of the border. But I will check again and see if there's stories about Oro or from Oro. They were very attentive to what issued from the provincial government. What was the government doing? What was government saying? What was happening provincially that would, that impacted everyone in Canada West.
Excellent, thank you. So Ellen Miller, who works at the archives here, not surprisingly, she's asking how many issues of the newspapers have survived. So how many issues of the Voice of the Fugitive?
There is an entire run for 1851. There's an entire run for 1850, 52. The run for 1854, so the newspaper was burnt down. I don't know. I'm thinking maybe that's what killed Henry Bibb. That was around after the newspaper was burnt down. He died. Did he inhale smoke? I'm not sure. But we have a full run of 1851, 1852, and parts of 1853. There, yes, I think there's been a discovery of some issues. The newspaper is also, you can read it online if you have a subscription with paper of record. You can go through there, and there are other internet sites that host the paper. So you can at least see the 1851 and the 1852 run.
Excellent, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Ellen says thanks as well. So she's just.
You're welcome. And you may be wondering, okay, so who's reading the paper? I mean, we often think that, enslaved people, runaway freedom seekers are not literate. But there's usually there's at least one person within a family that's literate. Not every person you meet on the street in the Black community or the white community had literacy skills, but literacy was on the rise. There's at least one person in the settlement who could read. And people would often gather to read the newspaper. One person, the reader, would sit somewhere on a chair on a table and read the news. So and remember too that people went to church, people were um, a part of church congregations. The pastors, the religious leaders were oftentimes the educated group within the community. They could read, they could write. Many of them had attended post-secondary institutions. So the pastor was also very important as a person who could read and did read the newspaper to the congregation.
Excellent, thank you. So anyone else have any questions for Dr. Cooper? So you can raise your hand, just take yourself off mute. I have one fellow here. CG Soto. I will unmute you here. Oh, Forrest, are you still there? I'll have to get you to unmute this person here. I don't have control.
Another way, if Forrest has disappeared,
Yeah.
People could type their question in the chat, right?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't turn on their microphone. I can only turn it off.
Okay,
so
they're
not
typing.
disabled. They just have to click the microphone.
Okay.
Oh, the microphone isn't disabled.
Yeah,
Oh, so
they're typing anyways, but yeah,
okay.
If you want to unmute yourself, you can go ahead. Okay, so you just posted a link to some free newspapers, including The Voice of the Fugitive. So there's a link in the chat there if anyone's interested in looking at The Voice of the Fugitive. I think there's some copies available there. So we had a question here as well from Olivia White. Just wondering if there is any more information about Henry and Melinda's daughter, Mary Frances.
Yeah, that is, can you hear me, John?
Yeah, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's $1 million question. I don't have any, and I'm in touch with the Historical Society in Kentucky because they are very keen on Henry Bibb being a son of Kentucky. And no, but I think with some more research, that information could be had, because in his autobiography, Henry Bibb's autobiography, Narrative of the Life and Adventures of Henry Bibb, an American Slave, he says that Melinda contacted his mother. His mother was still living in the South. And she wrote to his mother. She was in Mississippi, and said, basically, I'm fine. My slaveholder, uses me well. We know Melinda was sold as a concubine to a French descent planter in Mississippi. And so she basically said, yeah, I'm good. The child is good, but yeah, this is what it is. So it's a really, really sad story. And we know that Henry Bibb, nowadays we would say he had a nervous breakdown. Everything pointed to that. All of the way he wrote, the way he described his condition after the sale of his wife and child away from him, and then getting the news that she was sold as a concubine, it broke him in many, many ways. And I think we have to understand that's what slavery was about. It destroyed people's lives. And so for him to get back up and make such a great contribution to the freedom struggle is amazing. Henry Bibb is dead by the time he was 39 years old. He never saw his 40th birthday. And I would say, well, racism killed him, slavery killed him, because when you read his narrative and he is hiding out in the swamps with his wife and child because they're running from dogs and slave catchers. What does that do to the physical body, you know, to be hiding out underwater or being in the woods and you're hungry, there's no food. It's it really had a terrible impact on people's physical, you know, their bodies and on their well-being.
All right, any last questions for Dr. Cooper? We've got a few minutes here. Anyone? Olivia says thank you. Might have another question coming here in the chat.
Okay.
So just say thank you.
All right, thanks to everyone for coming out.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for being here. So thanks again, Dr. Cooper, this fascinating talk. Thank you to all of you for joining. Please join us next week. We have the next talk will be next Friday, February 17th. And we have Camilla Goure, which is exciting, kind of very different. Somebody's just kind of starting their career. This is a MA candidate at Lakehead University, who kind of a young woman who has a history kind of going back to childhood of community building, activism, and that's kind of what she's continuing into her academic career. And recently she's kind of been involved in helping the city of Aurelia develop a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy for the city. So it'd be another interesting talk next week, February 17th, same time, same place. You can find the link on our website. The talk should begin around 2 p.m. Friday the 17th. And then, yeah, we have kind of weekly different fascinating speakers, lots of different subjects. So we're very excited to have a busy schedule for you for this lecture series for this year's Black History Month. So looking forward to seeing you all again. Dr. Cooper, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks,
and
John.
Yeah, all the best.
It was my pleasure. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was great to having you. So hopefully we'll see you again sometime soon.
Yeah, take care.
Okay.
Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Bye-bye.